All right. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out here today. My name is Melina Burnside. I'm one of the co-presidents of Defend Our Future here at New Mexico State University, and I'm also a senior studying social work here. So Defend Our Future is an environmental activism club here on campus, and we've been partnering with the Director of Sustainability for the Facilities and Services to put on this Solve Climate Change by 2030 event. Before we get started with the event, I want to go ahead and let Allison, our sustainability manager, go ahead and go over a few housekeeping items.
Yeah, so we'll have the transcript function happening on the bottom. You can turn that on. So if you're interested in turning that off, it's on the bottom of the screen. It says live transcript CC. Just click on that. Also, thank you all for joining. And if you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A box also on the bottom of the screen. The chat has been turned off for this webinar, but you can submit your questions there and we'll be going over them at the end. Also, our upcoming webinars will be on April 21st at 6 p.m. We have Ria Chiletta and David Johnson talking about regenerative agriculture. And on the 21st on Earth Day, we have Michelle Graves for biomimicry and a sustainability research Ignite session of different pieces of research that we're doing here on campus that relate to sustainability at 3 p.m. So please join for any of those and have a wonderful webinar. I'll turn it back over to Melina.
Awesome. Thanks, Allison. So we're super excited to hear from Secretary McCamley, Representative Rubio, and Mr. DeSimio-Sophiliazo. We wanted to give you some context about what this event is, what Solve Climate Change by 2030 is. And so we're going to go ahead and start by showing you guys a video from the movement of Solve Climate Change by 2030.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 U.S. states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class. The teacher can assign tonight's webinars homework for the students, and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forward, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
All right, so I hope that video gave you a little bit of an idea of what Solve Climate Change by 2030 is. It's the second annual event that that has been hosted, and there's, like he said, there's over 100 schools working with this project. We're really excited that New Mexico can be a part of this international organization that's working to engage communities and schools in the conversation about creative climate solutions. So our first speaker today is going to be Secretary Bill McCamley. Then it's going to be followed by Representative Angelica Rubio, and then we'll have Mr. Patrick DeSimio-Sophiliazo. We'll go ahead and give 10 to 15 minutes for each panelist to go ahead and introduce themselves, and then we'll move into a Q&A session where you'll be able to submit any questions that you may have for the speakers on the Q&A function on Zoom. All right, so our first speaker, will go ahead and move into our first speaker, Mr. Bill McCamley. Mr. McCamley was a Las Cruces area state representative from 2012 to 2018. He has been a statewide leader in job creation activities like workforce training, border trade, and cannabis legislation. He's also a graduate from both Mayfield High School and New Mexico State University. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Secretary McCamley.
Melina, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today about this very, very important issue. And where I want to start is how proud you all should be being in New Mexico. In 2019, the state legislature, including Representative Rubio, agreed to pass what we called the Energy Transition Act. And it was one of the most progressive, forward-thinking pieces of legislation regarding climate in the country. And this bill did a few things. Number one, it mandated that New Mexico will have 50% of the energy supplied to the state be renewable by 2030, with the goal of having 100% be completely renewable by 2045. It also, in order to get to that goal, did a couple of things. It allowed for ratepayers, basically for the large investor utilities in the state, to pay a small amount extra in order to shut down the coal plant in the big coal plant in Farmington, New Mexico, which is what I'm working on right now, but also allowed for a lot of training for workers through the apprenticeship program. There's a mandated piece of this bill that says by, I think it's 2025, at least 25% of the workers on any either electric transmission or production facility in the state will be registered apprentices. And the whole goal of that was to get people into the trades and be able to help them get jobs. And so this is, like I said, one of the most progressive, forward-thinking bills in the country. Very, very proud to sponsor it. And the Workforce Solutions Department, which I'm a part of, is really heavily involved in this in the San Juan County area, as the bill also mandates $20 million be split up between our department of Workforce Solutions, the Economic Development Department, and the Indian Affairs Department to help that local group, both the cities and the county surrounding it, as well as the Navajo tribe up there, to try to figure out how to transition the economy away from this very hard reliance on fossil fuels. In the case of San Juan County, it's coal and natural gas. And so we've been working heavily on that, and I'd be happy to kind of talk about that process if y'all have any specific questions on it. But I really want to outline 4 basic challenges that you all might see moving forward as we move the state to a more clean energy-based future. The first is jobs. The fossil fuel industry requires a lot of labor. And this labor generally does not require a lot of higher education. So what do you have? You have a lot of very, very high paying jobs, a lot of times in the 6 figures, like we see at the coal plant up in the Farmington area, where folks don't have much more than a high school degree. And they've been able to provide a very, very good quality life for themselves and their families in these jobs. And once those jobs go away, transitioning these folks to something new is very difficult. A lot of times, and these are mostly men in a lot of these jobs, but a lot of times these jobs these gentlemen have had is the only thing that they know. And they make good money doing it. And so asking someone to say, okay, we might transition you and ask you to go into some kind of other field that you may have to retrain for and might pay you less and is completely foreign to what you do, it can be a challenge. The second thing I want to talk about is culture. We had a public meeting in Farmington regarding our efforts there and how we wanted to get everyone's opinion moving forward and what we could do to help them out. And there was this one lady who literally stood up and said, God put this coal in the ground for us to use. And if we don't take this coal out of the ground and use it to make electricity and provide for our families and our community, we are going against God's will. This is something that was said. Now, that's a very kind of hard example of what I'm talking about, but you have in the towns, and Representative Rubio can talk about this as well. She's from over on the southeast side. You have places in the United States where their culture is built around fossil fuels. And it's not only a, hey, this is an economic thing for us, it's something that we've grown up with. The other thing you're going to find is you see politically in the United States, you see this very large rural urban split happening in a lot of places. And I think as we look towards fossil fuels and how a lot of the impetus behind going clean comes from more urban areas, it could have a possibility of exacerbating that rural urban split. And how do we find ways of kind of addressing that and really being culturally sensitive and supportive of a lot of these rural communities who may not have the diverse economic bases that an urban area might have, but really rely on these fossil fuels. The third thing I'll talk about is the tax revenue for local, but even in a bigger state government. When I was in the state legislature, as y'all heard in my introduction, I was on the tax committee. And what I used to tell people all the time is that money to fund all the things that government does not come out of the rear ends of unicorns or is not guarded by leprechauns at the end of rainbows. It comes from taxes. And in New Mexico, depending on the year, between 30 to 40% of our state budget comes from the oil and gas industry through either direct taxes, where we tax oil and gas and coal coming out of the ground, or from the income taxes and gross receipts taxes generated by the jobs in that industry. Finding ways of replacing that revenue so that groups can be funded, like our K-12 schools, like New Mexico State University. When y'all pay tuition, you're not paying the full cost of your tuition. The state subsidizes that cost through tax revenue, and oil and gas, and to a lesser extent coal, but other extractive industries are a huge part of that here in New Mexico. So how do we move forward in a way where we can continue to fund schools, fund roads, fund all the things that we do without that revenue is going to be a very big challenge for the state. And the last thing I'll talk about is reliability. So I actually ran for the Public Regulation Commission in 2008, or 2010, excuse me. I didn't win, but the PRC in the state is in charge of regulating all of these big utilities and your electric bills, right? So every time El Paso Electric here in Las Cruces, or some of the other companies in other parts of the states want to raise your rates, they have to go through the Public Regulation Commission. And what a lot of these states, what a lot of these companies say all the time is that working on reliability, so making sure you have energy whenever you need it, is a real challenge as we move to a energy base that is more based on renewable resources. I used to sell solar panels. I have solar panels on my house. I love solar. There's no sun at night. So if I'm going to turn on my TV or my lights, as soon as the sun goes down, I got to have energy that can come into my house that is not produced by the sun. Wind energy, Texas relies really heavily on wind energy. And as you saw in the recent freeze, a lot of those windmills were not winterized. They didn't produce electricity, and therefore you had a lot of issues with their power. Or if there's no wind blowing, how do you make sure you have a grid, an electric grid that is set up to transfer energy from places where there is sun or there are types of electricity going? So these are some of the challenges that I think we all face moving forward, because we all want to get there. We all understand how serious this crisis is. We understand that climate change is real and it's contributing to hurricanes and forest fires and all the gentlemen in the beginning talked about in terms of migration and things like that. But in order to do so, we've got to take a very holistic approach and understand that there are real challenges in these and a bunch of other areas that we've all got to face together and come up with solutions for moving forward. So I appreciate y'all having me here. You have another couple of great panelists that I'm sure you hear from, and I'd be happy to take any questions anybody might have for me when the time comes. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Secretary McCamley. I really appreciate you breaking down those challenges of transforming to a green workforce. I also want to remind everybody that you can submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll go ahead and record those so that we can ask them during the Q&A section. So if you have them, go ahead and submit them so that you don't forget them. So our second speaker is Representative Angelica Rubio. Representative Rubio was born and raised in rural southeastern New Mexico, and in 2016 she won a seat in the New Mexico State Legislature, where she is now serving. She focuses on policy that centers disproportionately impacted communities by extractive industries and works towards a more sustainable economy for New Mexico. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to you, Representative Rubio.
Great, thank you all so much, and thank you for the invitation to participate. Again, my name is Angelica Rubio, and I sort of came into this work really kind of by accident. When I joined the legislature, I served in the Energy Committee for a brief time, and I realized pretty soon that there was very few people or legislators who were speaking to the consequences of not addressing climate from the perspective of frontline communities. And that was really important to me early on, and it's really what's driven my work in the legislature these last few years. My background, as was mentioned briefly in my bio, is that I was born and raised in the Permian Basin, and so the majority of my family and friends who still reside there. So it kind of puts me in sort of that middle between that conversation around the extractive industry and industry themselves here in the state of New Mexico, and then the environmentalists and what kind of policies we should be passing here in New Mexico. And so I certainly believe that we should be working towards towards ending our dependency of oil and gas. But we need to do it with us centered on this economic lens rather than just focusing solely on climate, because I believe that if we're centered on the economics of not leaving workers behind and not leaving these communities behind, a lot like what Secretary McCamley mentioned, we'll actually reach our climate goals much quicker. And so that is really what I really want to amplify is the work that was done in 2019 and the work that was done around the Energy Transition Act. And just to add to what happened with the Energy Transition Act, not necessarily with that piece of policy, but in addition to, and this actually happened with the help of Secretary McCamley, was that we were able to find funding to pay for a workforce development study. We had never really taken inventory here in the state in terms of what New Mexicans actually believed or thought about when it comes to transitioning away from oil and gas and more into a greener economy. And so during the 2019 legislative session, we were able to find the funding to pay for this workforce development study. This workforce development study was conducted by the University of New Mexico, and it actually started at the height of the pandemic. So last March, when everything was starting to take shape, this study was taking place. Like, we had all these plans of focus groups in person and doing all these things all around the state. It was all limited to, at this point, but through Zoom and using social media outlets. But in addition to that, oil and gas was collapsed last March. And so even in the midst of all of that, we were able to conduct this workforce development study by interviewing over 1,200 New Mexicans, so frontline workers, to get their thoughts and ideas around New Mexico and pivoting away from oil and gas and really making our mark towards a greener and more sustainable economy. And so it was sort of like this juxtaposition in that everything seemed like things were really collapsing, and at the same time, all of these New Mexicans participating in this study was actually really quite remarkable. And so to add to what Secretary McCamley mentioned, yes, absolutely, labor is a really huge issue in terms of people feeling like, what if there are not enough jobs? What if the jobs aren't as high paying as what many find in oil and gas and coal country? There's also the issue related to culture, of course. Like I mentioned, I grew up in the Permian Basin, just north of Artesia, and I have nephews who are incredibly proud of being oil field workers. Like, they pride themselves in the work that they do and the contribution that that industry makes to our state. But there's also that urban and rural divide where we need to really be able to identify ways to bridge the two while we're working to diversify our economy. And so the workforce development study was the framework that I utilized in really working and heading into the 2021 legislative session. And in partnership with other legislators and many of our coalition, both in the community organizing as well as in the environmental community, there was a lot of intersection between how we really work towards addressing workers and frontline communities, as well as protecting our environment. And I want to just really amplify and elevate the contributions that were made this past session and the work that was done between these different entities. I won't speak for Secretary McCamley when he was in the legislature, but what I will say that in the 4 years that I've been serving, the amount of collaboration between environmental communities and frontline communities from a power building perspective has been pretty amazing, especially when we're talking about this virtual session, which many thought was going to lack transparency and all of that. We actually had amazing turnout to all of the committee meetings, especially when it came to a few separate pieces of legislation. So we started with the Climate Solutions Act, which was House Bill 9. And House Bill 9 not only worked towards setting carbon targets, but it also created the framework around a just transition that used the framework of the workforce development study. And so all of the recommendations that came from that study were really just transferred from that study onto the Climate Solutions Act. So it was this huge, bold piece of legislation that we were really hoping for it to make it out of the session. Unfortunately, it didn't really gain the kind of momentum that we had hoped for. And so what I did at the very last minute was pull the just transition language which was the framework of the workforce development study, in addition to codifying the study itself, so that we could later go back and use that as a point of reference within our statutes, became House Bill 297. And then eventually we were just running out of time. The Senate was moving incredibly slow by hearing legislation. And one of the bills that was actually coming back to the House, which is where I serve, was Senate Bill 112. And Senate Bill 112 was creating just a simple, sustainable economy task force. And with the support of the sponsor, who is Senator Mimi Stewart, who is also the Senate Pro Tem, she was incredibly open to us taking the just transition language from the previous bills and really putting it into hers, which not only just creates the task force, it adds an advisory council, which centers frontline communities, particularly from Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And it also codifies this workforce development study that was really important to the communities that we were serving. And so I think moving forward, I think with the work that was done with the Energy Transition Act and getting us closer to our carbon goals, as well as all of the different work that's been happening ever since, like the legislation that we were able to get through this past session, there's a lot to really build off of. And as a matter of fact, I'm meeting with legislators tomorrow, as well as other groups from around the state, to start working on our platform for next year, because there's still so much work to do. And really thinking about issues of addressing climate, not from just a climate perspective, but really, again, thinking about it from this economic lens, where the things that we weren't able to get in, that we weren't able to accomplish this past session from what we originally had put into the Climate Solutions Act, like promulgating rules, contracting minority-owned businesses, for example. These are important things that we need to lift up, and so we expect to do that as well. There's a lot of issues related to equity, so it's not even just around meeting our climate goals, but really thinking about things through transportation, infrastructure, electrification, looking at issues around energy burden, and making sure that the lowest of income ratepayers aren't impacted. Broadband, we just passed, the governor today just signed the big broadband bill, which not only creates an office of broadband, but it also creates a council to really help in making sure that all communities have the connectivity that they need, not just in broadband, but in a much broader way of how we get connectivity throughout the entire state. And also seeing how that's associated with like grid modernization, and making sure that, because there's a ton of jobs in that area as well. And of course, what is the work that needs to be done to making sure that the infrastructure bill that's coming out of Congress, that there is opportunities for us to really work on addressing climate with the funding that's coming down from the federal government, to make sure that that this transition, while it will cost money, we know it's going to cost a lot of money. How do we make sure that low-income communities are not impacted by the cost? And so again, there's a ton of work to do, but I will reiterate what Secretary McCamley opened up with, and that is that we are very lucky to live in the state of New Mexico. I know that many people within our legislature, within our legislative body, they tend to feel or be somewhat cynical, because they feel like, well, it's New Mexico, we're very small. What kind of what difference are we actually going to make when it comes to climate? And the reality is that when we lead in these issues, the rest of the country will follow, and the rest of the world will follow. And so we need to continue this momentum. I'm incredibly grateful and humbled to be able to serve in the legislature, and to be able to bring opportunities for collaboration within not only just the legislative body and the administration, but from community organizations on the ground. I'm a community organizer by by day. And so to be able to bridge all of these different entities together to really focus on climate and how communities will be impacted is really the center of this work for me. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this effort, especially with New Mexico State, which is not only my alma mater, but it has been a really great ally in our work moving forward to really not only move New Mexico and transition New Mexico to a greener economy, but to a sustainable one that is not depending so heavily on exploitative industries that have really impacted our communities for many generations. And I feel we're in a turning point, and it's a good one. And I'm looking forward to continuing that, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Rubio, for your introduction, and also for your words on utilizing an intersectional approach to solving climate change by both including the economic perspective and also the perspectives of frontline workers. So our third speaker is Mr. Patrick DeSimio-Sophiliazo. He founded and coordinates the Seeding Regenerative Agriculture Project, which is a statewide initiative that works at the intersections of agriculture, the environment, and climate. In his presentation, you'll learn a little bit more about regenerative agriculture, how it can help address climate change, and how you can get involved as well. So go ahead, Patrick.
Thanks, Melina. And good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight to talk with you about how agriculture can help solve climate change by taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back into the soils. Depending on which studies and calculations you use, you might conservatively conclude that agriculture and our soils can capture up to 6 billion tons of greenhouse gas equivalents every year, representing about a sixth of our total human greenhouse gas emissions around the globe. David Johnson, who will be presenting later in the series and who leads the Institute for Sustainable Agricultural Research right here at NMSU, has achieved even more promising results. But in brief, at a relatively conservative estimate, our agricultural soils represent the potential to address a full sixth of our current greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not a silver bullet, but golly, that takes us a long way toward where we need to be. And so how does this work? Well, basically, it turns out that plants, like we humans, are really deeply dependent on their microbes. We have the microbial communities that we have symbiotic relationships with in our stomachs and digestive systems. Plants, it turns out, have symbiotic relationships with the microbes in the top 4 to 6 inches of soil where oxygen penetrates. And the microbes provide enough benefits to plants that when the plants capture the carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, they send a whole lot of it out through their roots to feed the microbes. The microbes bind up that carbon and make it part of the soils on a scale of centuries, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soils, which goes a long way toward helping us address climate change, and it also helps us address other challenges that we're facing in New Mexico, things like water scarcity and drought. It turns out that when you have more carbon in the soils act much more like a sponge, absorbing water more quickly, so we lose less of it to evaporation, and holding water longer. Again, helping address drought and helping the plants out a lot too by reducing their stress. Some microbes fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. Nitrogen is an essential plant nutrient that ordinarily needs to be applied through fertilizers. The microbes can do the work of fertilizers. Other microbes secrete plant growth hormones even. And collectively, the diverse sets of microbes that the plants cultivate by sending carbon out through their roots help suppress other pathogens, reducing the need for herbicides, various microbially targeted treatments that farmers would otherwise have to apply. Dr. David Johnson and Ray Archuleta can tell you much more about the specific details there, and their talk's going to be fascinating, so check it out. But cumulatively, through the benefits that microbes are able to provide through their symbiotic relationships with plants, it's possible to capture a whole lot of carbon, put it into the soil for the long term, reduce farmers and ranchers' needs for inputs, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, which increases the profitability of their agricultural operations helping our economic development. And sometimes even crop yields go up because the plants do better when the microbial communities that they have symbiotic relationships with are reestablished. So given all of these benefits, why isn't everybody doing this? Whew, there are a few answers to that. I'll focus on 4 big ones. So one is knowledge. It turns out that almost all of our conventional agricultural practices are absolutely amazing at producing a lot of food and killing pretty much all of the soil microbes. I mentioned earlier that the microbes live in the top 4 to 6 inches of soils. They require oxygen, and so when you plow a field and flip that soil over, you smother all the microbes. Also, the plants feed the microbes in exchange for benefits from the microbes. If you apply a whole bunch of fertilizers, the plants no longer need the nutrients from the microbes, so they stop feeding the microbes die. Herbicides, great at killing microbes, leaving the soils bare, so there are no plants to feed the microbes die. Basically, our current agricultural system isn't well set up for working with microbes. It's done an amazing job addressing global hunger and preventing the scarcity that folks were rightly worried about in the 60s and 70s. But it doesn't really work with carbon capture. So we basically need to reinvent a new agricultural system. And collectively, that system is called regenerative agriculture. There are a few basic principles that apply pretty much everywhere. Things like maintaining living plants in the soils, so that the plants can keep feeding the microbes, keep funneling carbon into the soils. Minimizing disturbance to the soils. Don't flip it over, don't smother the microbes, don't apply chemicals or fertilizers that can kill them. Maximize biodiversity. Plants, animals, the more diverse the system, the healthier in general. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, consider the local environmental context. It turns out that to implement environmentally sustainable and friendly agricultural practices, you actually kind of have to take the local environment into account, and the environment isn't the same everywhere. This means that you can't just take the same practices, say from Montana, that have worked amazingly and bring them down to New Mexico. The practices basically have to be reinvented locally, and that's a big barrier. Like Secretary McCamley, like Representative Rubio were saying, social pressure is also an issue. Unfortunately, in US culture wars, many things connected with sustainability have been tagged unjustly as liberal, when they are in fact really pragmatic things that we need to do to take care of the place where we all live. So we need to find a way to avoid the social pressures or bypass it. Related to the knowledge, a lot of the technologies to support regenerative agriculture are still in their early phases. And they're not necessarily the easiest to use or even available in our area. And lastly, economics, market channels. How do we develop the systems to reward farmers for the extra work they're doing, to bring value, and to basically create new channels for a regenerative agricultural system? That's where the Seeding Regenerative Agriculture project comes in. At its core, we have 2 main interventions. One is organizing peer-to-peer networks for producers, farmers, and ranchers to get together, work on each other's farms and ranches, help each other out, like barn raisings, but for sustainable agricultural techniques, and then sit down for meals where they get to talk about what they're doing, what they're learning, make plans for future work, and make really great friendships and business partnerships. Basically, even though nobody seems to have the full puzzle for how to get regenerative agriculture to work in our area, all sorts of people have individual puzzle pieces. And by bringing those puzzle pieces together, by bringing the producers together to cooperate, we can pretty quickly address much of the puzzle and get a lot of the system and its benefits up and running. That networking also helps reduce the social stigma, because instead of regenerative or sustainable agriculture being a political issue, all of a sudden it's just what the neighbors are doing, what other farmers in the area are doing, what other ranchers are succeeding with. And when you can see the benefits on other producers' farms and ranches, David Johnson and Ray Archuleta are going to have some amazing pictures and video to show you. It becomes much less political, much more pragmatic, and much more accessible. So basically, by organizing these cooperative networks of producers, we can help solve a lot of the knowledge barriers. We can help solve a lot of the social pressure. With technology, we're working extensively with Cruces Creatives, which is a makerspace in southern New Mexico. I got to have the pleasure of helping launch that and bring it into the project. We are putting together various technologies to help the producers implement sustainable and regenerative practices. So if a farmer, say, needs a specialized system to pit jujubes, a drought-tolerant crop that grows amazingly around Las Cruces, we can put that together and make the production much simpler. If they need specialized plows, we can make them. Inoculation systems for beneficial microbes, check. Send them out for testing, make the designs, release the designs as open source, and sell kits or fully assembled technologies for farmers and ranchers who don't want to go through the work of building it themselves. Further, advancing sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and also offering some economic benefits. And lastly, speaking of economics, the same cooperative networks of farmers and ranchers work amazingly for launching business partnerships. One of those, Backyard Farms, is freeze-drying mildly damaged or ugly produce that a network of over 20 farmers and ranchers around Las Cruces grow. It's amazing, shelf-stable for about 25 years, and it preserves most of the nutrients. That's one of several business partnerships that producers in the network have launched. Basically, through these interventions, we're working on a three-part theory of change to help regenerative agriculture spread from a very niche sector of the market at the moment into a mainstream practice. The first is helping farmers and ranchers share knowledge among themselves, learn how to practice it, and then coordinate support services to develop thriving local models of sustainable and regenerative agriculture. We've really got a good start around Las Cruces, and we have another great startup around Santa Fe. Once we've got the really successful models put together, then we can bring more producers in the local area into the group and start moving the local agricultural system toward a tipping point. It turns out that when there's technology that's really promising but really disruptive to existing ways of doing things, you need to reach a particular percentage of people who use it before it starts to enter the mainstream. This has been studied under something called the technology adoption curve. And basically, once you get to about 13 to 18% of people doing a practice, then all of a sudden, people who want to see other people do it first are able to see other people doing it, and it starts to become mainstream. So phase 2 is moving toward that tipping point where regenerative agriculture becomes a local norm. Lastly, part 3, we launch more seed groups around the state. We launch more of these cooperative networks. And then we repeat the process. We solve the local puzzle for how to implement regenerative agriculture under local environmental conditions. We create thriving models. We bring more people on board. And then in an approach kind of like raindrops and ripples, we repeat this whole approach throughout the state, eventually moving the entire agricultural system toward a market transition to regenerative agriculture and all of its benefits for solving climate change, water scarcity, and economic challenges. So that's what we're working on. Here's how you can come in. Regenerative agriculture is still a relatively new concept and approach, even though it draws on some relatively old ideas. So strangely enough, one of the most helpful things you can do is to talk to people about it. Talk to your friends, talk to your policymakers, let them know what's going on. With the Seeding Regenerative Agriculture project, we're working on the production side of things, but we could really use some help letting people know on the consumer side what's going on. Talk to folks. You can also apply some of the regenerative principles on your own land, keeping living roots in the soil, minimizing disturbance, minimizing inputs. If you've got a small plot of land, you can start to make a difference on your own tract. And of course, you can buy from local, sustainable, and regenerative producers. Things like backyard farms. The freeze-dried produce is amazing, and as of this week, it's available at Toucan Market just north of University. Give it a shot. And let's see what we can do.
Great, thank you, Mr. DeSimio-Sophiliazo, for the introduction and also for the brief description of regenerative agriculture. It's always inspiring to hear from environmental leaders, especially for me. I mean, when they're from New Mexico, and when we talk about climate change specifically to New Mexico, really hits home, and it's very inspiring for me to hear from environmental leaders. I also think we got a great diverse group of panelists to give us some different perspectives about how climate change affects the workforce, the economy, low-income communities, and also agriculture. So we're going to go ahead and move into the Q&A portion of this event. If any of you have any questions that you want answered, go ahead and put them in the question and answer function in Zoom. We might not get to all of them, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. So the first question that we have can go for anyone, so anyone can take a stab at it. It is, when will the transition to new jobs and new jobs surrounding the green workforce begin?
So I'll start, and I'll let kind of Representative Rubio maybe talk about her work, and maybe let Patrick kind of talk about some of the agricultural stuff. But the transition is already happening. We're hiring people, companies are hiring folks to work on transmission grids. That's one of the biggest challenges we have, is that as electricity has developed in the United States, it's generally been a local or regional thing, right? Where you build a power plant of whatever variety fairly close to an urban area, you build the wiring in there, and then that's how you get energy. We have moved away from that in the last 30 or 40 years to these large grid systems across the United States. And there's three ones in the United States, right? There's the East, there's the West, and there's Texas. And one of the things that we saw a few months ago when Texas had that big cold snap was one of the problems with not connecting outside of a region, because when their production went down, they couldn't ask New Mexico or California or New York or wherever it wasn't freezing for help. And so that's what you really see. And that's where you're seeing a lot with a lot of the wind and solar, for instance, in New Mexico. If we've got grid space that can transfer electricity to California, you know, when the sun comes up here, it does so a couple hours earlier than it does in California. You start producing, and you can transfer that energy to where people might be using it in California. So we need people to build those transmission lines. We need people to install those windmills and those solar panels all over the place. We need folks to do solar installation on homes. I used to work for Sunspot Solar here in Las Cruces, and I got a job selling solar panels, and we had a whole crew of folks that would go and put solar panels on homes. I think the question you're going to have to see is, moving forward, what are the challenges there? There's not a one-to-one replacement a lot of times between oil and gas and some of these more green energy type of economic drivers. The other problem you're going to have is a lot of the jobs that are in installation move around. So in oil and gas, if you're over in Representative Rubio's neck of the woods, from where she's from, out in, you know, the Artesia, Roswell, Hobbs area, those jobs are pretty much there. You go out in the fields, you do your pumping, you do your transition of stuff, but those jobs stay there. If I'm putting up windmills or solar panels or electric lines, those jobs are really, really good for a year or two, however long it takes to put in, but then they move on. Where does the community benefit? That's an interesting one. The other issue is going to be a lot of the R&D and manufacturing that is going to come out of these new job production things for the sectors. They're going to be in more urban areas, because that's where a lot of the universities that do the R&D are. That's where going to be a lot of the large scale manufacturing is going to be. And that's one of those urban rural splits that we talked about in our presentation. Now, just one more thing, specifically in New Mexico, we are working on the Energy Transition Act and trying to figure out in the Farmington area, San Juan County area, how do we transfer energy? And I put in the chat, or how do we transfer the economy? Those are the proposals that we got. We did an RFI in the fall, request for information, from folks that were interested in getting funded and telling us what their ideas were to create jobs up there using local stuff. And we got everything from value-added agriculture to film to tourism to petrochemicals, all that kind of stuff. So for anyone interested in looking at that, some of the proposals, some of the ideas that are actually in place right now that we're going to be considering are in a list right there for you. So hope that helps.
Yeah, and just to add to that, yeah, I agree with Secretary McCamley. Like, the jobs are there, but they're starting and they're progressing. There's two things that I do want to add to that as well, is that I think one thing that we need to start doing as a state, because I feel like we tend to do this a lot because we've been so heavily reliant on oil and gas, is that we may never be able, we can't compare oil and gas jobs to what we are thinking about, especially when it's just energy focused. We need to kind of get our heads out of this idea of like that we're only an energy focused state. We are more than that. We are more than just energy. And so this is why it's so important to really talk about the diversification of our economy in ways that it's not just about energy, but that it's beyond that. We've done a lot of work around the outdoor economy. We have a lot of different industries that are coming into the state that we're trying to really develop. And so part of that sustainability or that the Sustainable Economy Task Force that I was talking about, that was just signed by the governor yesterday, it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal just by the title of the legislation, but the amount of work that was put in to really work towards making sure frontline communities are a part of these conversations and that they're leading those discussions is absolutely critical. The second thing that I wanted to add, and I completely just forgot what that was, but I just really did want to focus on the fact that we can't just center ourselves around just energy jobs, because New Mexico is much bigger than that.
Great, thank you for those responses. We're getting a lot of questions, so stay tuned. So the next one that I have is New Mexico considering nuclear? Does this generate enough jobs, or do we have enough tax revenue to currently fund such large projects? Anyone can take a stab at that one.
Yeah, I can start. I actually chair a committee in the interim called the Radioactive and Hazardous Materials. Believe it or not, New Mexico actually has a committee with that title, because we are a state that has made a ton of contributions when it comes to nuclear. I think a lot of people have talked about, could nuclear be a part of our revenue sources? And I think economically, absolutely. Like, I think nuclear could be a part of that. I think what we need to also keep in mind, though, and this is something that I've been trying to elevate over the time that I've been in the legislature, is that we also have a very bad history and legacy when it comes to nuclear. There are communities all over our state, particularly in Native and tribal communities, that are still seeing the impacts of what nuclear has done to to their communities when it comes to access to like water and even just the health that many have experienced in terms of like cancers and things like that. Even when we're talking about the Trinity site, for example, there are families that in the state of New Mexico, where we were the central location for testing the H-bomb back in the day, there are families who have still yet to receive the necessary funding that they deserve to treat so much of the consequences that came from all that testing. So while I believe that there's a lot of people who are excited about nuclear energy and what that can do as an added bonus to like our revenue, I also want to just sort of have people to take a pause and maybe pump the brakes a little bit on that, because In the same way that we have been so heavily reliant on extractive industries, I also believe that they've been very exploited. They've exploited our communities for their livelihood. So people have had to choose between their health and their livelihood. And we feel that the same can be said about nuclear. I mean, just WIP just had another incident last week and down in Carlsbad. And so I think that the risk right now is still high up there. And I think for me, as I mentioned with the energy piece and jobs, I feel like we need to sort of expand beyond what those energy jobs should look like, or beyond the jobs beyond energy.
Thank you, Representative Rubio. The next question that we have, it says, when considering how to urge people to do their part in saving the environment, where do you begin? Implementing environmental policy and taking the steps to solve climate change is such an urgent issue. Where do you even begin to start pushing positive change? Because it is so big, people don't know where to begin, so they simply don't. How do you suggest implementing programs, policy, and action into a community, and specifically our community that encompasses so many Indigenous and Latinx cultures that are directly affected by climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I can start real quick and just say that's a really great question. I think right now, and I might have mentioned this in my comments earlier, is that sometimes it's hard to have these conversations, even within the legislature, because people feel like, oh, New Mexico is so small. How could we possibly address the issue around climate and make a difference? And I think the thing is that sometimes we don't even just look within our own communities. There's a lot of ways in which the city of Las Cruces, Doña Ana County, our rural communities are being impacted by climate right now. Those are the stories that we need to highlight. I love Greta and I love all of the work that's happening globally around climate, but I think there's a huge disconnect when you have Native and Indigenous communities here in New Mexico who don't have access to clean water. A lot of it has to do with the lack of infrastructure. It has a lot to do with just an injustice of us not just being able to just do our due diligence to figure out a way to do that. And so it's not necessarily just about recycling, and we have to really put it down in sort of basic understanding for how this is impacting people in the everyday basis. And it's really about there's ways in which it's impacting every single person right now in this community, and we have to be able to have those stories and amplify them so that people understand that it's not just happening in a different part of the planet, but it's actually happening here in our own backyard.
Melina, can I add to that? Just say two things. Number one, you can do things yourself to have an impact. I put solar panels on my house. I've had a carbon-free home now for 4 or 5 years, and that helps because whenever I've got the power on, I know that the sun is producing the power for my house. I haven't used a dryer very much for the past few years. I put my clothes on the line. It's 83 degrees and windy today. It dries faster outside on the line than it does with a dryer, and dryer you use a heck of a lot of power, right? So you can buy locally, as Patrick pointed out. You know, you can buy from folks that are producing food here so that you don't have to spend carbon getting food from a place far away, right? I would also say that y'all can affect policy and what different governments do in various different ways. As an example, is the city of Las Cruces, Doña Ana County, New Mexico State University, are they purchasing for their fleets electric cars? We are getting to a point now where, at least for some people, it can make sense to get a Nissan Leaf or a Tesla or whatever and charge it up so you're not using carbon for your trips that you're doing. Those are the types of things that y'all can bring up at the Board of Regents. You can bring up at the local city council. You can bring it up at the county commission. And frankly, there's congressional races, if we want to talk something bigger, every 2 years. Are you asking the candidates that are running for office, hey, what are y'all doing at the DC level? This is important to me. It's something that matters. We have forest fires here in New Mexico. We have a drought going on right here in New Mexico that are affecting our economy very, very deeply. and what are you doing to address it? And I think those are the types of things that, as people get together and talk about this, it does make a difference. I mean, Angelica can tell you, I can tell you, phone calls make a difference, emails make a difference. When people get together and organize and come and say this is important, and you hear it from a lot of folks, it tends to get addressed, because that's what living in a democracy is good for.
And Kendra, you framed the problem really eloquently as, complex and wicked. When facing such a complex, uncertain problem with unclear pathways and interconnections, it really is really easy to be paralyzed, because you don't know the pathway to solving it necessarily. You might know some very early steps, but the overall route is unclear, confusing, contradictory, and really a mess. That said, like Bill was saying, like Angelica was saying, the starting point can be just figuring out the direction you want to go, and then getting started. Multiple small things. You don't necessarily know which one will work well with your life, with your abilities, with what your contributions can be. But if you just get started and keep following the threads, keep moving in the direction you want to go, you can really start to make a difference. So get started with small actions, see where they lead.
Awesome. Thank you for those responses. Yeah, I think it's definitely, climate change is definitely something that we all have to work on whatever level that we can work on it. So thank you. The next question is specifically for Patrick, but if either one of you guys have other comments on it, great. It says, what type of support has been received from farmers within our community? For example, how supportive are they in wanting to make the change into sustainable agriculture practices that will help solve climate change?
At this point, we're working especially with the farmers and ranchers who are already really interested in implementing more sustainable and regenerative practices. In the parlance of the technology adoption curve, the people you might call innovators. They're the people who are deeply passionate about the cause and who are willing to experiment, to try new things. And they're very eager to share what they learn. So our goal at this point isn't necessarily to reach all farmers and ranchers, but it's to bring the innovators together, these people who are solving tiny pieces of the puzzle, tiny pieces where they can get started. And then by bringing those producers together, we're helping them learn from each other, create cooperative businesses, and work toward a thriving, localized, sustainable model of agriculture that solves multiple interconnected challenges facing our species. In terms of the numbers of farmers we have at the moment, we've got an active network of about 30 farmers and ranchers who are operating on about 20,000 acres total. So that's both a lot of land and a very small amount of land. But it's a starting point, and it's a pathway we can grow from.
I also wanted to add to what Patrick is saying in terms of what we've been doing legislatively is that this past year, especially as many of you already know, COVID has really unveiled so many inequities to many of us. And one of them was food insecurity. And one of the things that we were able to tackle through a coalition of folks is just really talking about the food system and how could we provide necessary sort of structural opportunities for local farmers and other entities. And we were literally a House vote away from passing this healthy food financing bill, which would have allowed for a, for many of you who are from here, from Doña Ana County, La Semilla Food Center, which is in Anthony, New Mexico, here in Anthony, they've been working with folks from all around the country to how to support particularly farmers and ranchers from communities of color. And they came up with this really great idea, and we for the last 3 years we've been working on this legislation, and it's really to be able to tap into federal funding to really make it down to the state of New Mexico, because that's one of the things is that there's not really a mechanism within our state to be able to really bring in some of this funding into the state to really address our food systems and the inequities around that. And so that is something that is going, the work is continuing. I know I received an email today about those group, that coalition reconvening. And so for the previous question, for example, like what could we be doing to really address this issue around climate? Like there are groups right now who are actively working on a lot of these issues. And I would really encourage that. I mean, I'm on social, you can access my social media. My contact info is online. If this is something that you all would like to be a part of, I can certainly direct you to the folks, because there's a lot of really great work that's happening. It's just a matter of time, which the infrastructure, our legislature is dealing and modernizing. That is just a completely different conversation that I'm also happy to have. But that's usually what we run into, is just a limited amount of time to do all these really exciting things in Santa Fe.
Awesome. Thank you for those responses. This next is directed at Representative Rubio. And again, if anyone else has any responses for it, that is totally welcomed. So the question says, the transportation sector is a big emitter of carbon pollution. As the chair of the House Transportation and Public Works Committee, what are some worthwhile projects that can reduce or eliminate heavy carbon pollution in our transportation?
Thank you for that question. So yes, this year I was appointed to chair transportation. I wasn't actually expecting it, and so it was a really great surprise. But for those of you who don't know, I ride my bike. I actually also ride my bike to Santa Fe every year to connect southern New Mexico to our state capital, because I believe that there is a disconnect, and my bike is sort of an extension of my body. And so it's just been the thing that I utilize as a tool to really to amplify the work that I do in the legislature. But I also feel that when we talk about policy and when we talk about like modernization of our grids and electrification and all of those things, I get really concerned that a lot of times we focus so heavily on personal vehicles and not on other things. So like for me, and excuse, my dog is outside barking at other dogs, but I believe that we should be, we here in the state of New Mexico, we are a rural state, we are a frontier state, but we also have an opportunity to really lead the way here in the state, where we can make it more feasible for us to electrify a lot of our state. I feel like public transportation should be electrified. We should make it so that we should be changing the narratives and the culture around using our bus system, for example, here in Las Cruces, that it shouldn't just be communities of color and those who are low income utilizing the bus system. It should be everyone should use the bus, because not only is it the right thing to do for our environment, but it's also really super convenient, and it's not that expensive. And so I think it's really just a culture shift of that. We don't need to drive everywhere. We don't need to try to do all those things. And I think for me now chairing a transportation committee, which also includes like infrastructure and capital works, I think we have to, part of the work and the efforts that I'm trying to work on is how do we actually change the culture around making, how do we change the culture for that it's not just about personal vehicles, but it's really about, it's really just bigger than that.
So the next question focuses a little bit more on actually water. So the question is probably Mr. DeSimio-Sophiliazo, you might be able to answer this. The New Mexico grows water intensive crops such as pecans and alfalfa. What are some practices that can mitigate the use of water?
Well, part of it would be transitioning to less water intensive crops that still have significant economic value. things like pomegranates, things like figs, things like pistachios, jujubes. They're less well known at the moment, but they can offer a lot of economic value and use much less water. Another option is to change watering practices, say with pecan fields or alfalfa fields. We do a lot of flood irrigation, which is great for delivering the large amounts of water that these plants need to them, but which means we lose a lot of water to evaporation, basically sending out feet of water over these land areas. So implementing practices like drip systems, emitters, other irrigation systems that apply precisely the amount of water needed to precisely the locations it's needed to prevent evaporative losses. Another approach is to implement regenerative practices within the existing cropping systems, because continuously cultivating various plants in between the other crops can increase the robustness of the soil microbial communities and increase the soil carbon and increase the soil water holding capacity. We can reduce the need to irrigate as much. So, in brief, 3 major answers. Best answer, switch to less water intensive crops that offer similar market values. Probably the second best option. It's kind of a tie. Implementing regenerative practices within the existing systems to increase the abilities of the soil to absorb and retain water to reduce irrigation demands. Concurrently with that, implement new watering practices for which there is some government support available through programs like the Natural Resources Conservation Service's Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program to implement more effective, less water-intensive irrigation systems.
Okay, great. The next question is going towards Secretary McCamley. It says, I am all for saying goodbye to fossil fuels and hello to cleaner renewable energy. How do you get the oil companies to stop and shut down their work in the San Juan Basin? Surely they won't do this without a fight. And New Mexico depends on the income from oil to support itself. What will replace those revenues?
Yeah, so let me take the second question first. That's going to be a really interesting question moving forward. You've had some states that have tried to put tax schemes on alternative energy production models like wind. The problem with doing that is that you get people to say, hey, if you tax us, we're not going to build as many of these things, right? So there's that balance there. I think you also have to look at other revenue streams that other states have that aren't as reliant on oil and gas and say, all right, how do they bring money in? But I think that really goes to Representative Rubio's point, which is the diversification of the economy as a whole. I know we're looking at film here in New Mexico. We're looking at advanced manufacturing in specific targeted areas. You're looking at what kind of long-term revenue can we bring to the state in terms of direct revenue and jobs with these green energy sources. I mean, we're one of, if not the best states in the country for doing solar. There are some full-time jobs that come out of that. And then you generate tax revenue off of the sales taxes, the income taxes, the property taxes, and all those. So you have to kind of look at this holistically. I know that's kind of jargon that all us university types tend to use, but it's true. You got to put everything together in a package, right? In terms of the San Juan Basin specifically, I think basically you're going to see if the local governments, if the local community groups, the schools can come together and start moving away from just that over-reliance on the fossil fuel industry and find real ways of contributing to their economy based on new economic models. I think that's when you're going to see the pressure really release. And what we use on that is actually something called BRAC, base realignment and closure. So when a military base shuts down, and the federal government does this every 10, 15, 20 years, they decide to close a military base, towns get really hurt. Roswell, probably the best example. They had Air Force Base up there. Angelica Walker Air Force Base, that's what it's called, right? Yeah. So they shut down there in the late 60s. And Roswell is now just back population-wise where they were in like 1965 because it took forever to figure out new strategies. The communities that did better were the ones that were able to kind of come together and say, all right, this is going to happen. What do we want to be as a community moving forward? How do we come together and get our schools, our cities, our counties, the state government, the companies coming together and say, we want to be a community based on film, a community based on value-added ag, a community based on whatever, you know, you come up with, and then you get behind it and make it work. From the bigger perspective, what you're also seeing is that some of these companies are moving towards green energy because they see the economic value. The more we can incentivize everybody, ourselves, these companies, to understand that moving in this direction is not only good from this larger, hey, it's good for the economy type, or it's good for the environment type thing, to the economic benefits, the better it's going to be. You know, we have a big STEM championship every year that we've been doing since the governor got elected, and Chevron is one of our participating folks. And they have, I've learned this, they have whole branches put aside to biofuel, put aside to new areas of energy production. So I think you're seeing BP, I know in England, is moving in these directions, a lot of places as well. The more you can show the economic benefits from these things, the easier it's going to be. And I'll give you one more example on that. When I was working solar, we had people that bought solar panels from us that were not ideologically about climate change. Some of them were, frankly, very pro oil and gas or whatever. But you know what? It made economic sense to their pocketbook, because if we could put solar panels on their house and the bill that they were paying for their loan that they would get for that is less than their electric bill, they come out ahead monetarily, game theory. And so the more you can make that work, the better it's going to be moving forward.
All right, thank you. So we're gonna ask 2 more questions, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. The second to last question that we have is, how do we make sure that communities of color are not left behind in the transition to a cleaner economy? And anybody can take this question.
Yeah, I mean, that's really an important question and a critical one, because and I think New Mexico, although we've had sort of our we've had a really slow process in some instances, I think over the course of the last couple of years, especially from a legislative standpoint, we are getting better at making sure that Black, Indigenous, and communities of color are at the center of this work. As I mentioned previously in my opening remarks related to the Climate Solutions Act and what now is Senate Bill 112 that was just signed by the governor yesterday, really the heart and the spirit of the legislation that was signed by the governor yesterday was work that was done by community organizations who do a lot of power building work around the state, and many are here, like New Mexico Cafe was able to bring in a lot of their members from not only Las Cruces, but from the rest of Doña Ana County, Grant County, Sierra, Hidalgo. A lot of their members were able to be a part of so many of the conversations related to how legislation would move forward to address climate. And the reason and the way that individuals who are at the front lines are being are really are essential to these conversations is because while they may not be thinking about these issues from a climate perspective, they're thinking about it from an economic perspective that actually gets us closer to meeting our climate goals when we're able to address these issues from an intersectional sort of way. So we have to talk about racial justice in the same way that we talk about climate justice. We have to talk about economic justice in the same way that we talk about the environment, and why many of these communities are at the forefront of the direct impacts and the consequences of climate change. And so, yeah, moving forward, I think we've seen that over the course of the last couple of years, especially under this administration, that having these communities be at the center of this work is absolutely critical. And it's what makes New Mexico so unique, is that even though we have this very complicated history and this a horrific history that many of us are still, many of our communities are still trying to to really address that. While we're still doing that, how can we also be making some effort in really pushing these environmental issues at the forefront of the communities that are directly being impacted?
Right, thank you for that response. Our final question, I hope that each of you can respond to this question. And I think all of you have alluded to what the answer might be, but I just wanted to ask, what would each of you say would be one big step that New Mexico could specifically take to mitigate climate change?
I mean, I obviously would say everyone should be riding their bikes, but that would be like one initial step. But I would also say that, and Secretary McCamley mentioned it just briefly a while ago, is that elections have consequences. And I think for me specifically, it's critical that if we are going to make advances in making sure that climate is addressed, we have to actually elect people who believe that climate change is a problem. And so that is really the only way that we can begin to address it, is that if we have people at the table who are actually speaking to these issues and actually understand these issues and know what the consequences are for not addressing them. They have to be the leaders that get us there.
Sure, I'll go. I mean, you can address this by saying there's little things that everybody can do, right? You can go through your daily lives and make a decision, as Angelica does, as I try to do when she rides her bike. I put my clothes out on the line. I mean, there's all these little things we can do. But I would say, in terms of the biggest issue, is something we touched on during the conversation, which is that diversification of our economic base away from this reliance on oil and gas. We are a state that right now really depends on this. And for people out there that say, hey, fracking ban and all that kind of stuff, okay, what are we going to do when the school revenue dries up X amount of percent if we stop producing? I mean, that's a really tough question to tell teachers and parents for their schools. About 45% of New Mexico's budget goes to K-12 education. Are you all willing to have your tuition go up, right, if our revenue drops because we can't fund NMSU as much? Those sorts of things. And I think the more we can diversify our economy away and look at things like film, look at things like the IT sector. Here in Las Cruces, you've got electronic caregiver downtown. Those types of things, the more we can allow for people to have other options and have more money coming into the state that is not just about, hey, we're going to export all this oil and gas. That's the biggest thing for me that will allow us to kind of move forward into the future in a way that is more equitable to everybody, so that we're not cutting folks off that rely on that funding for really needed things.
One other thing that both Representative Rubio and Secretary McCamley have pointed toward is that we're not in climate change alone, and we don't have to address it alone. There are all sorts of wonderful groups working to solve the issue through multiple different approaches. Get involved with one of them. If each of us joins with other people and works in the areas where we're best positioned to work, we can do this. Naturally, as somebody who works in the agricultural sector, I'm all for a transition of our agricultural system into regenerative agriculture. But that's my piece of the puzzle. Get involved with your piece of the puzzle and the people who are working to solve it.
What a wonderful transition for the closeout. If you want to get involved at NMSU, you can go to sustainability.nmsu.edu. How perfect. And you can check out the recordings of this and past talks and future talks and all that good stuff. And I want to thank our wonderful speakers and attendees, and Melina and Kyla, who have helped organize and moderate and take care of all of this. And they will be graduating this semester, so we will deeply miss them, and congratulations. And Frank and Santiago for keeping our Zoom working and setting it up. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a good evening.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, and see you in the field.